I would like to invite you today not only into my home, but also into the lives of two men who are main characters in the real life drama found in the book of Numbers. Their journey in this part of history can impact our faith journey today. In fact, in the New Testament of the Bible, in the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 10, it talks about the Israelites' 40-year experience of wandering in the wilderness to their destination of the Promised Land, being an example and a warning for us. Chapter 10, verse 11 says this, "And these things happened to them as examples for us. They were written down to warn us who live at the end of the age." So, let's dive into the book of Numbers once again, and let's take a look at Moses. Well, Moses was the top leader of a couple million Israelites, but he was devoted to the one true God. And God said this about Moses in Numbers 12, verse 7, "Of all my house, he is the one I trust. I speak to him face to face clearly and not in riddles. He sees the Lord as he is." That's in Numbers 12, verse 7. That's quite the accolade to receive, don't you think? And yet Moses is described as being more humble than any other person on earth, it says in Numbers 12, verse 3. Well, today we catch up with Moses in Numbers chapter 20, where he is still in the wilderness, both literally and figuratively. He's grieving the loss of his sister Miriam, who has just passed away. And the living conditions in this part of the wilderness are extremely distressing. There's no water. The people are furious. And Moses and Aaron are in the midst of fielding their anger and their complaints of the if-onlys and the wise. Listen to them. "If only we had died in the Lord's presence with our brothers. Why have you brought the congregation of the Lord's people into this wilderness to die, along with all of our livestock? Why did you make us leave Egypt and bring us here to this terrible place? This land has no grain, no figs, no grapes, no pomegranates, and no water to drink." We see the Israelites settling into the land of the if-onlys and the wise. It's a common gathering place found in the human experience. And more often than not, it's our first reaction when we find ourselves in the wilderness of devastating disappointments. You know, there are too many if-onlys and whys to mention, but some of them may be, why did we move here? If only he had gone to the doctor earlier. Why did I marry her? If only my kids had better friends. Why can't I seem to get ahead in life? If only they would talk to each other. Like the Israelites, we walk through the door and we settle into a room of questioning, rather than choosing to open the door of trusting God. While Moses and Aaron listened to the people for a while, and then they leave the crowd and they open the door to the tabernacle to meet with the one who has the answers, the one who can give them the perspective they need. In worship and dependence, they fall face down on the ground before Almighty God, and he tells them exactly what to do. They were to take the staff, which is like a rod, gather the people at a certain rock, and while the people are watching, they are to speak to the rock, and they would then see this rock pour out water to satisfy the whole community and their livestock. It sounds simple enough. Take the rod, gather the people, speak to the rock, and God would do the rest. But that's not how it played out. Moses takes the rod, he gathers the people, but in the time period between gathering the people and opening his mouth to speak, it would appear that the stressful circumstances of the past months and years get the better of him. And he begins to yell at them. "Listen, you rebels," he shouted. "Must we bring you water from this rock?" Then Moses raised his hand and struck the rock twice with the staff, and water gushed out. Moses loses control. His anger and his frustrations come out in his tone and in his action, striking the rock not once but twice. when he had been told only to speak and to allow God to do the rest. While the words that follow his outburst must have pierced the heart of both Moses and Aaron when God says, "Because you did not trust me enough to demonstrate my holiness to the people of Israel, you will not lead them into the land that I am giving them." Moses lost the reward of all that he had worked so hard for. Why? Because he did not trust God enough. His heart had become divided. He was seeking to maintain some control rather than fully trusting God. Why did Moses not trust God fully? Why was his heart divided? What about us in 2020? Why do we have a hard time trusting? Well, Pete Scazzaro, a pastor and author of the books Emotionally Healthy Spirituality and The Emotionally Healthy Church, gives a top 10 list of reasons why people fail to trust. Listen carefully and mentally check off the reason or reasons that you might be having a hard time trusting today. The first one is fear. Secondly, we worry that things will fall apart. Thirdly, we worry that we will fall apart. 4, sometimes we have a hard time trusting because of our family of origin. For many people, things were out of control in their families growing up. They were helpless and in some cases victimized, and now as adults, they resist letting go of control. It might be because of past betrayals of authority figures in our lives. Or we even have a distorted image of God. We don't see him as the loving Father that he really is. Or maybe it's a lack of stillness and silence before God. We get so busy taking matters into our own hands that we don't prioritize seeking God, reading the Bible, or praying. Or maybe it's even perfectionism. Everything has to go a certain way, our way, with no flaws, no mistakes. 9, we have limited view of letting go, thinking it's a one-time action, but in reality, letting go is a process of trusting Jesus every day, every hour, every moment. And lastly, he says it's denial. Denial that we actually aren't in control anyway. But the fact is, we're all vulnerable. And to think that we are in control of anything is an illusion. So those are the reasons. Let's acknowledge what it is that may be holding us back from fully trusting God. But let's take some time now to look at practical steps we can take to choose to trust in God. Theologian Frederick Dale Bruner, in his commentary on the Gospel of John, redefines trusting in Jesus as relaxing. He writes, "Relaxing in is a good modern translation of trusting in or believing in." So what might it look like to relax in Jesus instead of taking matters into our own hands and striking a rock, so to speak, to get what is needed? Well, when we're relaxed, we most likely breathe easy. We would calm down, we would loosen up, and we'd go about our day with the conscious thought that I'm going to choose to trust God in this moment, in this hour, in this day. But friends, it doesn't always come naturally, does it? It's really something we need to practice. Someone once wrote, "I practice daily what I believe. The rest is just religious talk." So if we really believe that God is trustworthy, if we really want to follow him with an undivided heart, we need to put it into practice. And here's a simple verse we can use to put that trust into practice even this week. In fact, I would suggest that you memorize these 7 words and you put them on repeat all week long. In you, Lord, I put my trust. From Psalm 25, verse 1. When feelings of anxiety rise up, in you, Lord, I put my trust. When I hear of a COVID case in my workplace, in you, Lord, I put my trust. When I walk into my school, in you, Lord, I put my trust. When I wonder if my business will survive this pandemic, in you, Lord, I put my trust. When my kid moves away, in you, Lord, I put my trust. When I wonder if I will ever get married, in you, Lord, I put my trust. When I wonder if life will ever get back to normal, in you, Lord, I put my trust. We can put our trust in God because He is good. Trusting in the goodness of God is our vaccine for worry, for fear, and it will help us to overcome those devastating disappointments. So let's take a couple minutes right now to focus on the goodness of God with this song. The words that God said to Moses in Numbers chapter 20, "Because you did not trust me enough," have rang in my mind all week long. It is so important that we trust in God. It is how we get through these devastating disappointments in life. There's so much we can learn from Moses. Well, the second main character that we're going to take a look at today is a guy named Balaam. His name appears 59 times in the Bible in 8 different books: Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Nehemiah, Micah, Peter, Jude, and Revelation, which is really remarkable considering who he is. Let me tell you his wilderness story. Israel had advanced toward the promised land, coming to the end of the 40-year wandering in the wilderness. They had taken over other territories on their way, and they were now camped on the east of the Jordan River, across from Jericho, on the plains of Moab. When Balak, who was king over that region, saw the Israelites approaching his border, he began to freak out. He was well aware of what happened to the other nations nearby who were against the Israelites, and now he was fearful that his territory of Moab would get overtaken and wiped out too. So he devised a plan to hire a renowned seer, a guy with supernatural insight, a diviner, about 450 miles away in present-day Iraq, and he asked him to come to help him. Well, you need to understand, Balaam wasn't a good guy. He was something of a psychic or a wizard for hire who had a reputation to connect with the spirit world and cast down curses on people. Jehovah God was just one of the many gods that he had in his repertoire of who he called upon. If he was a prophet, he was a small p prophet, a prophet for hire who was in it for the prophet, Profit. So this is the message that King Balak sends to this prophet for hire. It says this: "Look, a vast horde of people has arrived from Egypt. They cover the face of the earth, and they are threatening me. Please come and curse these people for me, because they are too powerful for me. Then perhaps I will be able to conquer them and drive them away from this land. I know that blessings fall on the people you bless, and curses fall on the people that you curse." Now, Balaam's response is actually admirable. He tells the officials, "Stay here overnight, and I will tell you whatever the Lord directs me to say." Well, God's answer couldn't have been any clearer. He says this: "Do not go with them. You are not to curse these people, for they have been blessed." Balaam makes the right choice, and he doesn't take the job. But King Balak isn't happy with the answer, and he sends a second delegation. He sweetens the deal, and he presses Balaam to come curse Israel. Well, once again, Balaam says, "I can't, but I'll see if I can change God's mind." You see, Balaam really wants this job. The money is good, and he begins to crack open the door of greed. We don't see this clearly in the book of Numbers, but in 2 Peter in the New Testament, in chapter 2, Balaam is mentioned again in a warning against false teachers. Peter says this: "They have wandered off the right road and followed the footsteps of Balaam, son of Beor, who loved to earn money by doing wrong. Well, back to the Balaam story. God does concede and he says, okay, go, but do only what I tell you. Well, Balaam likely gets up at the crack of dawn, saddles up his donkey, and he begins the trip to Moab with a delegation of officials. Then we read in verse 22, but God was angry that Balaam was going. Wait a minute, God's angry? Didn't he say go? Well, this would sort of be like Todd coming to me and saying, hey, I was checking out Rawhide tonight, which is like a teen challenge organization in the States where Todd has purchased numerous tent trailers, boats, motorcycles, all cheap restoration projects. And then he comes and he says, I found this sailboat. I'd love to purchase it. It's a really good price and I'm sure it wouldn't take much to fix up. And I clearly say, Todd, you are our MacGyver, and I know you can fix anything. But the answer is no. You have enough projects going on. Well, then a few weeks later, Todd comes to me again, and he says, hey, I was looking at that site again. The sailboat is still there. What do you think? And I say, well, okay. And then Todd leaves early the next morning to drive the 450 kilometers to purchase this sailboat. And one of my girls calls Todd while he's on the road and says, Dad, Mom's really angry with you. Todd says, well, why would she be angry? She said go. But here's the thing. Was it more of a giving in? You're going to bug me about this till I concede? But in my heart of hearts, I'm really upset that he didn't accept my first answer. That's probably a little bit of what might be happening here. Well, back to Balaam and his journey. Now things get really interesting. Let's pick it up in Numbers chapter 22. But God was angry that Balaam was going, so he sent the angel of the Lord to stand in the road to block his way. As Balaam and 2 servants were riding along, Balaam's donkey saw the angel of the Lord standing in the road with a drawn sword in his hand. The donkey bolted off the road into a field, but Balaam beat it and turned it back onto the road. Well, this happens 2 more times, and this poor donkey gets another 2 beatings from Balaam. Well, God eventually opens the donkey's mouth, and the donkey says, "What have I done to you that deserves you beating me 3 times?" Well, Balaam doesn't even blink that this donkey is talking to him. He just engages in conversation with his donkey. He says, "You've made me look like a fool," Balaam shouted. "If I had a sword, I would kill you." And the donkey says, "But I'm the same donkey you've ridden all your life. Have I ever done anything like this before?" "No," Balaam admitted. And then the Lord opened Balaam's eyes, it says, and spoke to Balaam, and Balaam heard God say this, "Look, I've come to block your way because you are stubbornly resisting me." God has just pointed out the error of Balaam's ways, that he was stubbornly resisting God. Well, the story goes on to tell how Balaam arrived at King Balak's palace, and Balak is excited because he believed Balaam was going to curse the nation of Israel. But each time Balaam opened his mouth, only blessing flowed out. In fact, he ends up blessing Israel 7 times. Well, obviously, King Balak isn't happy. Israel is blessed rather than cursed, and Balaam ends up going home empty-handed. But that's not the end of the story. Later in Numbers 31 and much later in Revelation chapter 2, Balaam is credited with having given Balak some strategies for defeating the Israelites and taking them down. In other words, even though he'd been used by God to bless Israel 7 times, his heart wasn't fully into it, and he still found a way to come against Israel. So here's the question that I asked when I studied Balaam's life story and the interpretation of his life written in 2 Peter and Jude and Revelation. What are we supposed to take from this interesting but strange story of Balaam? Well, I think it's this, that having a genuine experience with God doesn't guarantee that you will stay close to God. Balaam had come out of a horrible past that had God as one of his options, but he also delved into all sorts of other spiritual stuff that had nothing to do with the one true God. But then he has this extraordinary encounter with an angel, and he becomes God's representative. Balaam had a genuine encounter with God, and he starts prophesying God's words. Essentially, Balaam joins God's team, but he does so with a divided heart, and he doesn't end up staying close to God. And we are warned to stay away from the ways and the doctrines of Balaam. You know, a story like Balaam's has potential to be our story too. God was one of our options to pursue, and then one day we had a genuine encounter with him. Maybe it was while we were in our own personal wilderness experience and we watched God miraculously carry us through. Or maybe we encountered God in a church service or at a camp or at a conference or on a mission trip. And we walked through the salvation door and we chose to follow Jesus. We took next steps like taking the Alpha course and getting baptized, and we started serving in church. We joined a small group and we felt so close to God. We were reading his word regularly, talking to him daily. But then slowly over time, our priorities shifted. And we were really no longer interested in listening to God the first time. Greed for our personal time, our personal desires, our personal financial security take over. And then that becomes our focus. Oh, we'll seek God again when we get through this crisis, or when we get through this financial setback, or this relationship issue. We'll pursue God more when the kids are older, or when this heavy workload decreases. And our heart becomes divided like Balaam's, and we end up stubbornly resisting God. If you follow Todd on Instagram or Facebook, you've probably seen his many projects, and you may have noticed that he has a particular passion for fire. In fact, in our back patio and yard area, we have 5 fireplaces or fire pits, not including the barbecue. He really likes fire. Well, recently he completed a wood-fired pizza oven, and it has a little thermometer on it. He'll light a fire and you can hear it crackle and pop and watch that thermostat climb. But not long after, it'll start to cool. So he'll go out and he'll add a bit more firewood to the oven, and once again the thermometer will climb. 250, 400, 600 degrees. But 20 minutes later, even though there are glowing embers in the oven, the thermometer starts slipping toward the cooler side, and he needs to stoke the fire and add some more fuel. You know, our relationship with God is like that. One encounter with God will never keep you going. You need to constantly be aware that fueling the fire of your faith is essential. We don't want our hearts to become divided, and we end up becoming warnings like Balaam did. Do not be like Balaam. My encouragement to you today, church, is that you follow God fully with your whole heart, that you listen to him the first time, that you become engaged with all sorts of ways to stay connected to God. So church, my question for you and for myself today is, how are we going to continually fuel the fire of our faith so that it's something that will last and we won't steer off the road of faith and become like Balaam? Well, the first way would be to pick up your Bible. This is God's words to us. He wants to speak to you, and he will do that through this book. And we have a very simple way of engaging with this, and that's our chapter a day Bible reading plan. Reading one chapter every day and asking God, what can I take away from this for my life? Remember what 1 Corinthians chapter 10 said? that all of this was written so that it would be warnings and teachings for us to take a hold of. There's something in it for you and for me to pick up every single day. So I would encourage you to do that. And lastly, thinking back to Moses, let's remember how important trust is, choosing to trust every day and putting on repeat that verse from Psalms, I will put my trust in the Lord every single moment of this week coming up. I will put my trust in the Lord.